Hey everyone, I hope you can see me okay. If I could get the thumbs up, but I think you can hear me and see me all right. And I just wanted to say good morning and to kind of reflect on how shockingly fast time flies, because it just seems like yesterday that we held our inaugural Greening the Landscape conversations. And I'm excited to say that today is the beginning of our second phase of the consortium. Some of you may know, but I'm Evan Pilkington, and I'm from the Vineland Research and Innovation Center. And I'm proud to take part in today's event as your moderator. So, for a bit of housekeeping at the outset, I'd like to encourage everyone joining us today, if you can, or if you're interested, to share your involvement in these conversations using the hashtag Greening the Landscape. And I'd also like to take a moment to have a colleague of mine briefly share the context for our gathering and a few exciting developments from the past few months. And I'm happy to introduce Rhoda de Jong, who leads the Greening the Landscape Research Consortium, who is the host for this conversation series.
Thanks so much, Evan. It's great to have so many of you here today. Yeah, I was at the Canadian Urban Forest Conference all last week in Winnipeg, and this is held every other year. But I learned so much just by having informal chats with different folks throughout the week, and it just is like a stark reminder to me how important these sorts of like question and answer conversations are. So I'm really hoping that people in the audience can send in their questions as well at the end of this conversation. We go through some of the questions we've already developed. So as you mentioned, Evan, these online conversations are hosted by the Greening the Landscape Research Consortium, which we lead here at Vineland. And it's this really unique collaboration, all these different members of the urban tree value chain. So from tree nurseries to municipalities, landscape architecture, we all come together and we conduct research together, and we try to build the collective capacity of the Canadian urban tree value chain by developing this knowledge and sharing it through forums like this and elsewise. The consortium was launched way back in July 2021, which seems a long time ago now. With 14 founding members, we've grown to over 25, and we continue to grow as we get greater interest. And yeah, we've made some substantial progress towards our aim of improving urban forestry operations in the region. Yeah, and we're excited to have you join here today. We had over 150 individuals register, and it looks like our count is just topping out at 100. So welcome.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rhoda. And as Rhoda mentioned, the conversation series was introduced as a platform to mobilize knowledge. So we're very on this with ISA Ontario on the conversation today. It's worth noting that if you are an ISA member looking to collect CEUs for the session today, please remain in the webinar for the full duration of the event so that our event metrics show that you attended the entire session. So with that out of the way, as you know, we have two excellent guests with us today. First, we have Nadina Galle joining us, and Nadina is an ecological engineer. She's a National Geographic explorer, a well-known speaker, and a Fulbright scholar. Nadina is best known for coining the Internet of Nature and is currently celebrating the publication of her first book, The Nature of Our Cities. Nadina earned a joint PhD in ecological engineering from the University College Dublin and Trinity College Dublin, and her research continues to leverage emerging technologies to build nature-rich communities. As well, we have Marilyne Carrey. She's an associate professor in the Environmental Sustainability Research Center at Brock University in Ontario. And in the context of environmental sustainability, her research program is largely focused on the application and use of geospatial technologies to study urban forests, wetlands, and grassland ecosystems and their change over time. She's committed to making her research relevant to the wider community by engaging in innovative community engagement, partnerships, and collaborations. So Marilyne, if you don't mind, I'll put you on the hot seat and start with you today. And perhaps if you could please start us off by helping me to understand What technological advancements do you see having the greatest potential impact on urban forestry in Canada today? And feel free, if you wish, to share any stories if you've seen these innovations in action.
Thanks, Evan. The question prompted me to think about how long have I been thinking about technologies to study the environment, and it's over 30 years now. I can't believe it since I started my undergrad in where you are now in Ottawa, Ontario, at Carleton University. And I worked with a forestry professor there in my early years of undergrad. And I would have to say that of all the technologies, I think that we've seen the most advances in geospatial technologies. Those location-based technologies like global positioning systems, geographic information systems, or GIS, and remote sensing. I wanted to pick one that I think has made the most impact, but the whole suite of technologies have been used to study the environment, to study urban forests in terms of their structure and function, in terms of, where they are, what type of forest, their distribution. And we've done that using both active and passive remote sensing devices in particular. So I'm going to focus on remote sensing as my one sort of technology that I think has the most promise and has changed the most. From my undergrad days of looking at air photos to now having satellite technology all the way down to drones to look at urban forests. And this distinction between active and passive sensors is important because we either sort of passively record energy emitted from the earth, including thermal energy for forest fire detection, but also actively in terms of one example would be light detection and ranging or LiDAR technology. And those active systems send a signal like a tennis ball down to the earth, and we receive that tennis ball back at the sensor, and that tells us a lot about forest structure, depth, understory. So these remote sensing technologies, I think, have been particularly impactful in helping us to really fully understand urban forests. So using two of those, I'll take, for example, the active system LiDAR and a passive system of sort of traditional satellite remote sensing have been used really successfully in Abbotsford, BC, Vancouver, Toronto. Some pretty major sort of larger municipalities have been able to access those technologies a bit easier than smaller municipalities. So Niagara Region, for example, has 12 municipalities. I've worked in one, the town of Lincoln, to help them with their urban forest goals, including urban tree canopy assessments and inventories. And I can tell you that they are challenged by limited resources. But we'll talk more about that in a moment. But yeah, I think that remote sensing has been most impactful.
That's great. Thanks, Marilyne. And I know we'll have a chance later on, and also the audience will have a chance to contribute some questions to you. But I mean, I'm genuinely so curious about how pervasive, how adopted, how regular is it for municipalities and arborists to use these technologies? I mean, how pervasive is this, in the industry? And I'm sure others will be interested in finding that out. But first, I thought I'd check. Nadina, do you share this perspective on these technologies? Do you feel that this is the, these are the emerging technologies?
Absolutely. It's such a hard question, and there's so many different technologies to choose from. And I feel like we live in the golden age of trying to figure out this link, this intersection between technology and urban nature and urban forestry. But specifically on urban forestry, I have to agree with Marilyne that those location-based technologies, the remote sensing technologies, they have definitely changed the game. And they've also been the technologies that I would say have been the most widely adopted across municipalities, both in big cities, mid-sized cities, and small cities, and the ones that we've seen a lot of different advancements in, right? Starting really from, pen and paper recording of information, then inputting that into a GIS system, a GIS database, even before it was really map-based. Now moving to, different software that we have where we can actually input that information, but then have it be on a tablet and immediately put it into map format, and being able to communicate that map format to the broader community, which is so exciting, right? Not only having location-based technologies and remote sensing be something as a management tool, but actually is a really important community engagement tool, which is something that I'm really passionate about. And Marilyne talked about these, great examples of bird's eye view, right? Top down remote sensing technologies. But one of the ones that I'm really excited about is actually, Marilyne mentioned LiDAR, and she was talking about aerial LiDAR. One of the technologies I'm really excited about is terrestrial LiDAR. So the same technology using laser on a really fine granular scale, but then instead of having that come from the top down, having actually that scanner be put either on top of the car, on a bicycle, or even on a backpack and walking through an area if it's not available for cars, and mapping the urban forest around us. And the reason why I'm so excited about this, because I think it's absolutely revolutionizing the thing that we know as tree inventories, right? I would argue are the foundation to any solid and successful urban forestry master plan. You cannot manage what you don't measure. You have to understand what you have in your urban forest, where your trees are, the condition of them, ideally the species, the age, these are all things that terrestrial LiDAR can help us manage. And one of the innovative ways that I'm really being seen it used is there's a huge, enormous role here for artificial intelligence in helping us really understand what this data means and helping us transition into something that I've heard called as ecosystem service targeted urban forestry. So really looking at the urban forest as something that provides all of these free benefits that we know to be as ecosystem services, right? Whether that's providing cooling, shade, transpiration, health equity disparities that we know that exist, providing health benefits, providing things like stormwater interception, the filtering of air quality, all these benefits that trees provide us. Can we actually change our urban forestry policy and using these mapping technologies to actually incentivize not only, for example, the planting of stems and the removing of stems every year, kind of a traditional tree accountancy, but actually using things like both aerial and terrestrial LiDAR to move to something that actually changes the definition of success in urban forestry. So actually looking at not how many stems have we removed or planted every year, but what has the increase in crown volume been year over year? Hopefully it's an increase, of course, could also be a decrease, but hopefully it's an increase. And actually using that to say, hey, if we invest in urban forestry interventions here and here, can we actually model that into the future and tell us something about the ecosystem services that are going to be provided to this community in 5, 10, 20, 40 years down the road? And that is something that we're seeing in just a few select cities around the world. Singapore is a really well-known one, but I hesitate to use that as an example because it's so difficult to relate to a city like Singapore with a completely different government structure and completely different investment. So I'll use a mid-sized city just south of Amsterdam, where I am at the moment. It's a city that only has about 30,000 trees on its public lands. They use LiDAR to map their tree inventory on public land in a matter of days, something that used to take them years, in a matter of days. And what they've actually done is they've actually changed the definition of what urban forestry success means to them. And they're actually planting and changing their policy to really incentivize this growth in crown volume. And I'll just end with this. The reason why that's so innovative is because we are losing year over year tons of old, massive, huge ecosystem service valuable trees every single year in cities, more and more of them, more than we, I think, realize. And of course, we have these things like replanting obligations. But until we really truly understand or are able to map the value of these individual trees, I don't think we'll ever fully get there. And changing this definition of success from stems to crown volume, I think is one really, really important way of getting there. And as Marilyne said, it's the remote sensing technologies that are going to help us get there.
So first of all, both of you have provided, just such an interesting, like literally just a glimpse into what I think are, fascinating directions. And I wondered, Nadina, if you don't mind expanding for a second, just to help me understand, from this terrestrial system you're describing, doing inventories as opposed to, aerial surveys, how prevalent is that? And who is the provider for that kind of service? Is that the realm of arborists? Is that the realm of municipalities? Who is delivering that on the ground inventorying digital service? Is it a private sector, how Google drives around with their system on a car? I mean, what is the parallel in the arborist world?
So I've seen two different approaches for it. I've seen, the municipality, contract commission, the mapping of terrestrial LiDAR. But the thing is this is really tough data to analyze, right? This goes even a step further than analyzing something that I did during my studies is satellite imagery and a GIS system, right? We're really talking about something that you're working in the 3D. So this is a specialized skill set. So the company that I've seen be most innovative in this is Davy Tree. They've really opted this concept of the smart tree inventory, and they've been working together with a company called Greehill. So it's really this collaborative effort between Davy Tree and Greehill. And Greehill originally is a Hungarian company, but they actually really hit the world stage when they've worked almost exclusively with Singapore and the National Park Service of Singapore to help really get Singapore as, I would say, the first city that had a full digital twin model of all of its trees. And that's 7 million of them, if you can believe that. So you can imagine the kind of liability issues, management, maintenance issues that a city like the city of Singapore is dealing with. And now, so Greenhill and Davy Tree are taking this technology throughout Europe, but they've had a lot of success, from what I've understood, in the US as well, in getting this to be more commonplace. And of course, this is a difficult one that I hope we'll have some time for, is also how do you navigate those technological transformations with the urban foresters and arboriculturists of today? How can we ensure that they feel they are very much part of the solution, and that a technology like this is not replacing them or their skill set or their hours, but is in fact helping them to optimize their work so that we have a good baseline? Because I think we can all agree the time of pen and paper tree inventories is old-fashioned and hopefully done, and we need to find a way to move forward, because we have a massive challenge of managing all of these trees. But then also urban foresters and arboriculturists also have a massive role in communicating the value of the urban forest to the city and to council makers. And my big hope here is that providing that data is going to be able to help them do that in a way that's succinct, efficient, and hopefully get them the resources that they need and deserve to be able to take better care of the urban forest now and in the future.
The question that you're touching on is really about scalability, affordability, ease of adoption, the cost of adoption, who is the service provider, who manages those contracts, who is releasing the opportunity to do this. I wondered, do you know, like, in your opinion, are there simple but impactful technologies that are available now? Is there that are affordable and functional to kind of take that step in this direction?
I think taking that step towards a smart tree inventory, right, that's going to require a capital investment. But I think that there's a lot of really interesting things that are a lot more ground up and citizen based that people can be doing. One is taking part in something called the City Nature Challenge, which is a collective action. It takes place in over 700 cities, and that's growing every year. They just organized the 9th annual edition. It always takes place at the end of April, beginning of May, and it's just 4 days where the community members are actually encouraged to go out and identify as much wild flora and fauna as possible, including, of course, our trees, using the iNaturalist app. Another example is this fantastic story from the city of Melbourne, where the head of urban forestry and urban ecology team at the time, Yvonne Lynch, had a lot of issues because the city of Melbourne was losing massive amounts of trees to drought and all kinds of different issues. People understandably had a lot of questions, and she would get all of those questions in her inbox. It would be impossible to figure out which tree they were talking about. So she decided to really pair up each tree's individual ID number with an email address, to basically as a management tool to help her organize her inbox and her teams. And what ended up happening was something that really surprised everybody, is instead of exclusively asking questions or having concerns about the individual trees, people actually started writing love letters to these trees. And it went so viral, first Melbourne wide, then Australia wide, and ultimately over the entire world. People were writing trees to Melbourne's, people were writing emails to Melbourne's trees. And I'll end on this. The one thing that I love about that is, one, super replicable, right? Super cost effective. It's like assigning email addresses, right? It's like one of the more lower tech options that we can do. And what it does is, I think it shows to a broader audience, and it helps also urban foresters and arboriculturalists to have the stories of why trees are so valuable, what trees mean to the people living in cities. And that's something that I think is so underrepresented, right? We talk about trees as having all these important ecological functions. I'm talking about it myself, ecosystem services, right? But much more importantly than that is, I feel like trees are these last living bridges that we have from both the past, present, and the future. And having people write stories about their favorite trees and publishing those stories, and that storytelling approach is one of the most effective approaches urban foresters have in their arsenal to communicate their value of their urban forest.
That I think that's an incredible story. I love the idea of connections to nature, any opportunity to connect to nature. I mean, what a meaningful program technically, and as you say, in a heartwarming way. I mean, that's fascinating. I think we could have a whole session just on that idea. I think that's amazing. And Marilyne, knowing you have such an investment, a personal interest in community engagement, stakeholder engagement as a major plank of your work over the past many years, could you also, I mean, do you have examples, or do you want to weigh in on simple but affordable innovation that you've observed?
Absolutely. It's so enjoyable to listen to this conversation, and then I'm like, oh, and so it's you know, if I had talked to my 19-year-old self about mobile apps that we use now, right, to engage you know, community citizen science efforts, like, I would have been just so excited, right? The technology has changed just so much. Some of the, you know, maybe I'll focus on some of the smaller communities, smaller municipalities, because I think Nadina nicely summarized some larger sort of cities. And I think of the smaller ones I've worked with, like the town of Lincoln, Ontario, for example, where they don't have a lot of resources, right? They, you know, they'd lost an arborist at one point during our project together, and that created several challenges because we haven't really prioritized that work. And it, you know, really has been, here's pen and paper, and, you know, mapping out your tree canopy that way is really tricky. So I think some freely available software packages, iTree Canopy, for example, and a whole suite of iTree software packages. More recently, Planet Geo, for example, where they're offering these kinds of mapping opportunities for communities to have a better sense of where their canopy is. And the base of those technologies is typically satellite data. These optical data that we can get information, especially around the type of tree and the species, etc. I think one really important piece is that when you're looking at smaller municipalities, larger as well, though, you really need to engage and collaborate with others. And I think it's really important to look at NGOs, for example, that could be participating, as well as residents, right? But also universities and colleges that can provide the expertise, the resources, the hardware and software. You know, a lot of these data sets are huge data sets. So you need to be able to store those data. You need someone that knows how to analyze those data to see if they're actually giving you accurate, precise results about your urban tree canopy, right? I conducted a study with a student at Brock University, for example, in our Master of Sustainability program, Baharak Razagirat, who now works at Vineland Research and Innovation Center, which I'm excited about. And we looked at the, you know, satellite-based data versus using iTree Canopy to estimate percent cover and look at land cover in the town of Lincoln, and provided that information to them which I think is fantastic, and that's a success. But I think where we could do better is to have the resources there to support the implementation of. So we have the results. Now, how do we move forward with implementation, right? So I think collaborating with others, Geospatial Niagara was part of that project as well, which is a not-for-profit that I'm part of. And I think, you know, tapping into those as well, right? Along with those bio blitzes. The one cool thing that we did with Geospatial Niagara was for St. Catharines, Ontario, we had a free tree giveaway and tagged trees and put their biodegradable tag on the tree saying it's, you know, its age, its diameter at breast height, the species, and then asked residents to use a QR code to then upload the location of where they plant that tree on private property. Access to that information, unless you have a view from above, is really tricky for municipal governments, right? So have them plant the tree, and then, you know, every couple of years, why don't you go out and measure that tree? Tell us the condition of that tree, right? So all of those pieces are really important. Thinking about disease propagation and mapping out disease in urban areas too is really, really important. So that was really an interesting approach. And if I have another moment, the other really cool one that I've heard of more recently has been because insurance companies are increasingly interested in what trees you have on your property in terms of risk management. So open houses provide opportunities to go and look at trees, but also to think about, and you're seeing now drone data being used to kind of advertise on MLS, for example, for looking at housing listing, or Zillow is another example, where now they can also indicate if there's, people want to know, are there trees on the property that are of significance? How many trees? What are their benefits? Right? All of those pieces are really important to our health, for example, right? But also in terms of kind of mitigating damage caused by climate change and adapting to that change. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, I mean, everybody's here to hear you talk, so there's no reason to apologize. I think it's fascinating. And, you raise an interesting point about all the different stakeholders in a community who now have such an active interest in tree cover and in canopies and the types of trees and their ecosystem services that they're providing. I mean, you touched on insurance, you touched on property owners. I mean, many of the people who are listening in, or who may be part of the consortium, are interested in some of the practicalities. We've touched on a few of these things, but one of the stakeholders that's kind of prompting action is the province and provincial rules that now require the municipalities track green infrastructure assets, right? And I mean, from an applied perspective, and I know we already have questions coming into the Q&A, which we'll get to in the last bit of our event today, but I mean, can you recommend tools for improving people's approaches to tree canopy assessments, Marilyne? Are there critical aspects that should be done as opposed to the entire assessment overall? Do you have suggestions for improving tree canopy work? And by best approach, I mean quickly, accurately, affordably.
I think what's really important in giving this advice is to first step back and say, really ask those questions. What information is needed? Why? Who's using it? How are they using it? Is the tool user-friendly? All of those pieces. Is it free? Is it a subscription? I can see us going down the road to address some of these challenges with limited resources, the arborist's work that is not always prioritized, or I could see some municipalities choosing to go that route, right? The paid for, and consulting firms are commonly hired to do a lot of the work. I think it's important to look at some of these freely available. So for example, in the study with Baharak and I, we actually learned that iTree Canopy gave as accurate results as the satellite data that we used, Worldview 2 data, 2-meter spatial resolution data, that we had comparable results, enough that you could at least use that as a quick, accurate way of assessing the canopy with iTree Canopy. And then maybe think about doing those more detailed assessments every 5 to say 8 years is roughly what the literature would suggest. We're bringing in, and I agree with Nadina, LiDAR data gives us rich information about the canopy that we don't get from traditional optical sensors that tend to operate above the canopy, right? They can penetrate through the canopy and get at the understory. So I think it's just really important, though, to keep in mind that when there's costs associated with the data and software, etc., you need expertise. So, I see municipalities spending on resources going 2 routes. Either they're going the route of, let's hire a consultant, which can be quite expensive. And the other route is to then maybe look at some of these freely available software and data resources, especially for the smaller communities. Larger ones are doing it really well. The Torontos, the Vancouvers, they're able to afford these more sophisticated data, right? And technologies to really do a complete assessment and analysis of their urban forests.
And this is on a frequency. It's like a frequency, every 5 to 8 years.
That's what we found in the literature, that it's really important. I mean, there's massive changes happening to the urban tree canopy, right? We think of what's happening in Canada with Jasper, right? I have a colleague that does some LiDAR surveys of forests right near Jasper for the purpose of thinking about forest fire potential, etc., right? And these large tracts of forest just completely obliterated. I think it's really, really important to have access to detailed and accurate information fairly regularly. But, what are you doing in the in-between? The other piece is that, you need to think about what technology you're adopting, and then how will you track or monitor change over time toward targets, so that you use that information to affect policy and all of those other pieces, while also keeping in mind what's happening to urban forests as climate changes, and how do we adapt to that, right? How do we mitigate the impacts of that? I think I mean, the municipalities are at the forefront of that. Municipalities on all of the Great Lakes, for example, right, have had massive challenges with flooding, and other communities having lots of issues with forest fire. So really, really important question.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
go ahead.
I mean, Nadina, do you also have recommendations for green infrastructure asset, assessments, how to actually conduct this work, and again, sort of the critical work between those, large 5 to 8 year major assessments? What are some critical aspects to deliver maybe more frequently, and how is this done in your perspective?
We didn't set this up, but I think this this project I want to tell you guys about just fits so perfectly into a lot of the limitations that Marilyne just outlined. And that is something called the US tree map. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with that. I know we're speaking to a broadly Canadian audience here, of course, but just something to, have some inspiration from our friends across the border. The US tree map was established by, Marilyne mentioned Planet Geo. Planet Geo is an urban forestry technology company. And I believe one of the most innovative in terms of trying to, as Marilyne really well said, finding mapping and data solutions that are scalable, that we can have data more frequently, and that are going to be more affordable as well. Gone are the days, hopefully, I believe, where you have like the 150,000 canopy assessment that happens. It's this massive capital investment. And then you're left with that data. And then, like you said, you have this, in between time. And then, it might take, hopefully it's 5 to 8 years, but it might take 10 to 15 years before you can get that kind of capital investment again. And that's really tough. And we know how, these are living organisms, how rapidly trees can change, diseases, pests, flooding, forest fires. Like, we're having all of these rapid changes, and we need our data to reflect that as well. So all that to say, the US tree map, to the best of my knowledge, is the most detailed and up-to-date source of tree cover data that the US has. And essentially what they've done is, instead of taking the traditional approach of we're commissioned by a municipality, so we're going to go ahead and map all your canopy, they work together with this technology firm, GIS technology firm called Earth Define, to actually go ahead and map canopy assessment for the entire country of the US. So essentially what they've done is and this is again why artificial intelligence, specifically computer vision, is so important to making this happen. It's providing that scalability. And they do this at a 60 centimeter resolution. So this is really, really high granularity data. And essentially then what Planet Geo has done with them is to basically partner with them and have this pre-analyzed tree cover data in these parcels that you can then purchase from them to have this understanding. But the nice thing is it's instead of this one capital investment, it's more of a subscription model where you have access to this data as it's changing. And one of the use cases that I'm really excited about is one that I learned about from the public landscape manager of Santa Monica, Matthew Wells. He's been in Santa Monica for about a decade. He was in New York before that and the UK before that, where he's from. And Santa Monica had an issue that I think, whether or not you're Santa Monica, I think a lot of cities can relate to this, is that 50 to 70% of the urban forest is in fact on private land. Municipalities, of course, are responsible in part kind of for that, but mostly they're in charge of what's going on public land, right? And private land, 50 to 70% of the urban forest is on there, and it's a huge blind spot. And I know this also in Amsterdam, where I live currently. It's this massive issue because you have all of these tree planting efforts that are being done, these maintenance efforts, these heritage tree efforts that are being done on public land. We're protecting thousands of trees there per year, but at the same time, we're losing thousands and thousands, and I mean thousands of trees on private land every year. We're seeing massive urban deforestation on private lands, of course, due to development questions, the building of ADUs, additional dwelling units, which are, again, really important in this housing crisis. So it's all of these different stakeholders coming together. And just to get back to this whole story, why I'm excited by this US tree map, this collaboration between Planet Geo and Earth Define, is that it provides really rapid, scalable information about what's happening also on private land. And doing that in a way, because you would who's going to get typically, a capital investment to really understand what's going on private land? That's a really difficult sell to make. And I would encourage urban foresters and arboriculturists in the audience to also have the courage to stand up to a lot of policymakers that don't want you to look at what's going on private land. That is as much your responsibility as an urban forester, even though it doesn't directly fall into your domain. It is something that's so critical to the health of the urban forest overall, right? Marilyne was talking about diseases and pests and things that can really affect the health of the urban forest as a whole. The tree, the pest doesn't care if it's on public or private land. We need to start looking at the urban forest as a whole. And something like this US tree map and having access to this kind of high granularity data is something that I hope will make that a lot more accessible, whether you're in a big, small, or medium-sized city.
I can see you nodding your head a lot, Marilyne, to the comments about, certainly the scale and scope of the challenge associated with engaging private property owners, right? On this level who do you feel does this well? Where do you look as an example or an inspiration of, a community that engages its private, landowners effectively? Do you have any sort of North Star that you look to that you find really motivating? I'd just be curious.
I'm most familiar with the activities of Geospatial Niagara, because I've been part of that not-for-profit, right? That's had a lot of success. For example, in my work with the town of Lincoln, I convinced them to, have a free tree giveaway and to actually adopt these practices. And they put together website resources for residents that could then use QR code, look at the trees. They also talked about each individual tree species that I think is so important. Then you get the buy-in, right? Often people, some people just, they're blind to nature around them, right? They don't really even notice. So to equip people, and this not-for-profit also targeted youth, right? Who have real interest and stake in the environment, right? And they talk about climate change, right? And they talk about how disease is creating challenges in the tree canopy in urban and rural areas, right? So I think, that we have to maybe see the value in that there are really great groups of people doing some really interesting work through, even I think of Niagara Parks Commission and their BioBlitz days, and have people out, like Nadina said, using iNaturalist, for example, right? I think is really important. Then when you start communicating about, hey, we should be mindful of Tree of Heaven as one example, as a host to the spotted lanternfly. Right now, Canada, Niagara region in particular, is very concerned. Spotted lanternfly has made it across the border a few times, and people have actually reported seeing them and, killed them, right? And this has been mapped on iNaturalist as an example, so we can actually track that. So knowing more about Tree of Heaven, and for residents to know that too, is really helpful. That's one of the few hosts, right? Another is, of course, grapevines. So it's a pest that's of particular interest to us. And rather than reacting, we want to be proactive about our management of that kind of challenge, right? So I think that's a really important piece in addition to what Nadina had to say.
For sure.
I think that, could I add to that, Evan? Yeah. I'm so excited to hear about all of these different ways that you can bring citizens into it, because even though I'm a big fan of smart tree inventories and terrestrial lidar and what they can offer, I do see it as kind of, you can almost see it as like a base layer. And then I would love to figure out ways that we can get the community involved in filling in those gaps, right? Because smart tree inventories have their limitations now and most likely in the future. Like, for example, right now, species identification through terrestrial lidar really, 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 really difficult. It might just be that we're not quite there yet, and it could be much better in the future, but that's something that is really difficult right now. Things like health and condition assessments, also really difficult, right? Figuring out, we need to be really honest about the limitations of these technologies, and I see that as a really important part of my work too. And, I always love this kind of Silicon Valley quote of fall in love with the problem and not the solution. Remain very critical of the technologies that we're bringing into this field. And as Marilyne really said really well, is making sure the first question you ask yourself is, what are we using this data for, and why are we doing this? That is such a critical question to answer. But imagine if a city had a smart tree inventory, and then you were able to get as we've seen in cities like New York, who organized the largest that we know, this NYC tree census, getting, much like the City Nature Challenge, getting your community out there to help you, but not count trees. So not like how we've done in the past, but actually have the citizens help you fill in the gaps of the smart tree inventory. So helping them, sending them to targeted trees where we need more information on condition, on species, on the health of the leaves, for example, on looking at different markers of pests and disease. I think these are really interesting ways that we can have this beautiful synergy between the technology and the people on the ground.
Are there examples, or are there communities that you're aware of that are linking that baseline, the municipal inventory work, to community groups? Is there is there regular exchange between tree-oriented community groups, youth, schools, and so on, to help contribute to that base layer, to enhance the data that's being collected? Do you see that very often?
Not very often. I would love to see more of it. But in chapter 2 of my book, I go into great detail about how the New York City tree census came about. For those of you that aren't familiar, this started in 1995 when it was Commissioner Howard Stern, and he was a parks commissioner at the time. And he had this idea, which was we need to understand how many trees that we have in New York. And he put Fiona Watt, who was just a forestry graduate at the time. She's been with the New York Parks Department ever since. And he put her in charge. He said, here's the number 1-800-TREE, something I think that was actually the number. They would call Fiona, and she slowly gathered this army of pen and paper tree trackers. And they would go around, these volunteers, as they were called, and they would do the pen and paper first ever census in 1995. Because they organize it every 10 years, you see these incredible technological jumps that the tree census makes every year. So then in 2005, they went a step further. They had this rudimentary GIS app that they started inputting things in, but it was still happening after the fact. Then 10 years on, 2015, right? We're in the time that everybody has a smartphone. We're able to do this via an app. So they did the tree census still with volunteers, completely, citizen volunteers, and we're able to input these things directly into the app. Now we're approaching on 2025. So I asked Fiona when I interviewed her, what's next? And the first thing that came out of her mouth was terrestrial LiDAR. I want to see what we can get in terms of a baseline model, but then figure out ways to still include citizens in that. And one of the most beautiful ways that I think that could be done is also, yes, having all of these metrics about trees. And, New York City has done a fantastic job at coupling that tree census with iTree and all these other, eco canopy models that Marilyne mentioned as well, so that we have an idea of the ecosystem service valuation. In fact, small side note, it was that having Fiona was the one that spearheaded having iTree come to New York based on that data. And what came out of that is a number that, many of us have come across, that in New York, they found for every dollar that was invested in the urban forest, it got about $5.60 in the return on investment. And now, of course, we're in the era of Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who, of course, was an investment banker. So all he saw was a 560% return on investment in the urban forest. And that's what's launched the Million Trees campaign in New York. And it's a fascinating story of how important that storytelling and how important data is to that storytelling to communicate the value of the urban forest. And the one thing that I would love to see kind of in this next iteration in 2025 is not only focusing on these ecological benefits of trees and what it does for us and having citizens fill in these gaps, but also allowing citizens to write stories, make personifications, even anthropomorphize their favorite tree a little bit to add that additional story layer of going further than trees are not just important for heating our cities, shading our cities, and all the ecological benefits, but trees have an inherently almost spiritual role to play in our cities today.
And I like tying that together, in fact, because it is important to keep that in mind. I mean, we can really get bogged down in the technical aspects, right? I mean, technological solutions. And actually, earlier in this conversation today, it was brought up that this work and these technologies are not actually meant to replace the human activity, not only of inventorying, but the human appreciation of this landscape and its contributions to livability, right? So there's a broader connection. And again, when we talk about LiDAR, it's not LiDAR replacing human inventories, it's the complement to human awareness of this ecological function, right? And so I wonder, actually, I've been, perhaps you're aware as well, and I really feel badly that this is not a 2-hour conversation or maybe an afternoon where we're all hanging out in a park. But I want to mention that I've been tying in some of the Q&A questions as we go. But there's one that has come up that's very specifically technically focused. Wondering if either of you might have recommendations for reliable or moderate cost terrestrial LiDAR. I mean, where do you look for this to start incorporating this?
And I would be happy to have this conversation offline too, if anyone, I don't know if you put up our contact info at the end, Evan, because I have quite a few papers that I'm looking at around this, but that is, I think, one of the challenges that we face, right? LiDAR technology from aircraft or from spacecraft can be quite expensive. So you would need to do just a very sort of limited area. And I know of communities who have done that with some success, which is fantastic. You know, you're looking at thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, you know, depending on the area that you're looking at. But you also have to have the expertise to analyze those data and storage capability as well. One cool thing I want to say, though, to Nadina's point about the species type and the condition of that, you know, that where LiDAR falls down, some cool work is happening. So hyperspectral remote sensing, where we look at the electromagnetic spectrum very finely, we can actually get that rich information about species, and that's well documented in the literature. And recently, data fusion techniques have been used to actually put spectral data onto each point of LiDAR data. Super cool. So that's coming in the future, but people are onto that. You know, there's other techniques like around, you know, AI technology, machine learning. And so we can use maybe small areas and then use that information. So just collect imagery over, you know, a tiny part of the landscape and then apply that to a larger area, right? Often, you know, there's kind of this rule in geography that things that are close together tend to be more similar than those that are further apart, right? So yeah, that's an important, I think, piece to add to that. But it can be, yeah, the range is, and I have a few papers that show, like, compare costs and whatnot.
Well, I mean, related to that, Marilyne or Nadina, I mean, have either of you witnessed communities at the, you know, municipal level that have actually publicly incentivized? I know, you know, when we deal with technology startups all the time, and much action is prompted by incentives, let's say grants and funding and, you know, offsetting capacity buyback programs, other things. Have you witnessed any interesting incentive programs at the municipal level that would allow student or community groups to engage? Can you think of any? I mean, it would be great if, referring back to Nadina's discussion on the Planet Geo work, that, I mean, to conduct regional efforts to a Canadian outcome of similar scale, right, requires incentives. Do you know of any interesting examples in that respect?
Well, I can draw from a few examples I have, not necessarily from the municipality side, but from the university side. Like Virginia Tech has done some great work around the tree canopy and mobilized those data at Brock as well, right? So, you know, we can tap into funding opportunities that the municipalities can't, getting back to collaboration, right? Why it's important. So one example is I collaborated through the Brock Lincoln Living Lab with, in the ESRC that I'm part of, the research center I'm part of. And what I did is collaborated with our library, and we have a great, you know, data set of digital products, but they also purchase imagery. So I worked with them. They purchased imagery that I could use in my remote sensing courses, but then I could also use in my research. So they were open to that possibility. So I've just recently secured some more Worldview 2 data covering the entire town of Lincoln. And now I can actually look at change over time, right? You know, some of these pieces of information the town of Lincoln wouldn't necessarily have. It's not, you know, new cutting edge research, but it gives the information they actually need and want, and right, and at a very low cost. In fact, it cost me nothing and it cost them nothing. And I have access to the software and the students who can then analyze those data. How exciting is that? That a student that worked with me on some of those freely available data now works in the town of Lincoln at Vineland Research and Innovation Center,
awesome.
right? Like these are the ways that we I think we underestimate the potential for human beings to cooperate, to collaborate, to work with each other okay, let me apply for this grant opportunity through, Green Municipal Fund is a great example that you can partnership universities and municipalities. Municipalities can reach out to me and say, hey, let's work together. I'm like, yes, we have ArcGIS products readily available and students want real work experiences. So we're finding that that's happening, on campuses all over the globe, right? That these kinds of unique collaborations. So from my perspective, I think those are really fantastic examples. We've engaged the K to 12s too. And I continue to do that work through the not-for-profit, through Brock University. We collaborate with Vineland Research and Innovation Center too. Like there's just so many rich opportunities to find ways around some of the limitations with resources and funding.
Well, that's great. And you mentioned a fund that's through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the FCM. And I mean, it's great to mention that. And we should, those are kind of really super indirect investment opportunities, funding opportunities to get some of these technologies into hands of people and to get projects off the ground. And just as a quick last thought, Nadina, do you see areas that you would love to see greater investment to help technology companies get off the ground from either municipalities or governments? Is there an area where you just wish that, funding or investment was available? What would you suggest?
I do think I would love to see a broader awareness of public land versus private land when it comes to the urban forest. I think, as I mentioned before, that is a big, big blind spot. And it sounds very scary to a lot of urban foresters, right? It's not a politically sexy thing to get involved in. And that's why I kind of had this call for courage to talk about these issues and map them and understand what the specifics of that look like in your city. But also for the average citizen, right? Yeah, it's a massive challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity to have 50 to 70% of the urban forest on private land. The more that we can do as urban foresters, as horticulturists, as green professionals in this field to raise awareness about the value of urban forestry, have incredible, locally specific projects like heritage trees and getting monumental status protection for specifically large and really interesting trees in our cities. I think that's a beautiful way to, again, create the storytelling around trees. And I mean, I would love to talk about more broadly what the power of storytelling can do for urban foresters and arboriculturists. I think that's a hugely kind of undertapped, potential of what that could do to communicating the value. So I would love to see more work there, right? Not just have these super technically specific skills in urban foresters, but also these softer storytelling skills are going to become so important, especially into the future.
Well, I think that's a very hopeful and functional message to end on, because I have a background in science communication. I think the whole point of these conversations, this is a nice way to wrap it up. Thank you. That the point of this conversation is knowledge transfer, sharing information, and doing that effectively, I think, is an evolving process. And it's something that, I'm glad that we're investing in. This whole group, everybody in the call today is sort of taking steps in that direction. So I find it really motivating. And I'd like to close out on that note, close this conversation by expressing, on behalf of the group, our collective appreciation to you both for joining us today. And you've shared generously. I think we could have, had lunch and snacks and carried on this conversation, because there's a lot of interesting stuff to dig into, and hopefully at a later date. Marilyne and Nadia, thank you very much. We appreciate and also extend our thanks to the ISA Ontario for their collaboration. And I'd like to thank all our members who make the Greening the Landscape Research Consortium possible, as well as our support from the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership. Lastly, thank you to everyone who attended. We value your feedback and excellent questions. It's clear that everybody's passionate about these things and all things urban forestry. and urban greening. So if you'd like to join in as a member of Greening the Landscape Research Consortium, please be sure to reach out to us. And as a friendly reminder, the next Greening the Landscape conversation will be on November 6th at 11 a.m., in which we'll be discussing social equity as it relates to urban forests. That's everything from us today. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.